Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new series that I will be sort of hoping to semi-regularly get to, and it's basically going to be themed around this with the YI prefix, and it will be continuing with whatever the subject matter is. And then this one is why I'm disappointed with Company of Heroes 3. So, I've been a big fan of Company of Heroes since the original came out. It was, in my opinion, a revolutionary real-time strategy game. At its core, it completely refreshed the genre. It brought an interesting focus onto the World War II setting, which at the time had become a little bit stale for a lot of people because of just an unending number of first-person shooters and stuff like that. But Company of Heroes, I felt, really hammered home a collection of a brilliant single-player campaign, a fantastic looking engine, really, really unique mechanics for the time, good multiplayer, and a challenging skirmish AI with great modability. Loads of maps are available alongside other like gameplay mods and stuff. And Company of Heroes went from strength to strength. We got it to the second game, which is still played by a huge number of people today in its online competitive modes. It had plenty of DLC, added a bunch of different nations in there, and yeah, it just continued the great format. And it feels like the third game really should have just been a great sort of addition to what had been produced with Company of Heroes 1 and 2, and somehow they didn't. And I don't know if this is something with Relic and the number 3, but as we saw with Dawn of War 3, there's just something there. The element that really makes it click just doesn't seem to exist. And in this case, it feels like a bit of a step back in many respects. The new theatre is a logical choice because the previous two games we had, the Normandy, the D-Day landings and stuff, and pushing through France toward, obviously, Germany, and the DLCs have covered things like battles in the Netherlands and Belgium. We had the push through Caen from the British side, and obviously Arnhem and all those kind of things, Operation Market Garden, and we've had the Eastern Front right the way from the early Barbarossa point right up to the fall of Berlin, and so it makes sense that this game would cover a bit of North Africa and the majority of the Italian theatre of war. So it makes sense as a choice, but for whatever reason, maybe it was just a number of smaller design decisions. It just doesn't really feel that engaging, that engrossing like it used to be. It's not that the gameplay itself has fundamentally changed. It still has all of the broad strokes that make Company of Heroes fun. The light and heavy cover mechanics, suppression, retreat, being able to use vehicles in the mid to late game as basically your endgame units, infantry that could pick up weapons and that kind of thing, recrewing, being able to garrison buildings and stuff. I just don't know what's happened. It just, something is off. And it might be because a number of features from Company of Heroes 2 just weren't in there from the start. I know a lot of the online community have rightly had complaints with things like leaderboards not being available right from the off. Certain gameplay options for multiplayer are just missing entirely. That even the UI feels a little bit I don't know, clunky, unintuitive, and the fact that by the time that I made this, the first major update to the game was one that added cosmetics, and the cosmetics aren't even themed around actual units from the war. They are, but they don't look like the units' uniforms, where they had an opportunity to basically give you a wide depth and breadth of Commonwealth uniforms for different British units, and obviously American units and German units and stuff. They just went with very painfully generic looking stuff. It's overall, it's quite bad. For me, I'm disappointed with it for a couple of reasons, though, as this video is titled. My disappointment with the game comes from the fact that the campaign, it just isn't great. There are some elements in that I like, and if it was a totally different, I don't know, if it was a totally different genre or a totally different franchise, and this was the campaign mode, I don't think it would be too bad. But Company of Heroes, I always felt worked really, really well when you had those well-scripted, well-paced single-player campaign missions. They were really great, and you can play through the first and second games, and they're seamless. They're just all fun. They were unique. Each time they had different kind of sub-objectives that you had to sort of challenge yourself to complete. The attack and defend missions were really, really fun. And this one, they went with this kind of procedural setup, because you have the entire campaign map, and you've got these turn-based style of gameplay now, where you're moving little armies around bits of Italy, and you're capturing villages and towns, and sometimes you'll bump into an enemy army on the map and you'll have to fight them, and then it's like a procedurally generated map, or at least it's from a pool of maps that they've made, and you have very basic objectives, and there's no kind of narrative or reason for this happening, because it's not based on any historical engagement. It's just like there's a German recce platoon, and your Indian Commonwealth artillery platoon has encountered, or company has encountered them, and now you're going to have this fight, and you have a really, really just 1v1 against the AI, like you're playing a skirmish match, and that's it. And then you move on, and you can capture airfields and stuff, and you can have planes bombing, and you have naval assets that are striking targets and stuff like that. And there are some interesting mechanics, but it just doesn't fit. It doesn't feel like Company of Heroes. It feels like you're playing a different game with some Company of Heroes gameplay in there. My other major disappointment for me was the fact that, once again, we end up with a scenario where our factions boil down to two different German factions and the Allies. I know historically you can't do much, but the Allies have an unusual set of units available to them, especially the British. It feels strange, like the Black Prince, for instance, being available, despite the fact that the Black Prince was never used in combat. I don't know why that was brought in, when they could have just had late model Churchill if they really wanted something like that. Hell, they could have had the Comet if they really wanted to do something out the box for a late tier unit. But yeah, the Black Prince was an unusual choice. It's weird things like that, just strange unit choices. They don't really fit, and the British Army is this like bizarre mix of like early North African units that were way out of use by the time the Allies had arrived on mainland Italy. You had like there's Crusader 2s driving around, Matilda 2s, and neither of these units were in use by then. They were woefully out of date. They had very little impact. The guns were very low quality by comparison. They couldn't penetrate armor at that stage of the war, but here we are. There's a potential that you can drive around in a Matilda 2 on an Italian map. It's strange. And then, for me, Deutsche Afrika Korps as a faction makes perfect sense if I was playing a campaign and the multiplayer was all set in North Africa, which I actually feel if the whole game had been the North African theatre, you could have had 3 or 4 campaigns, where you could have had an American campaign that was based around Kasserine Pass, with the struggles that the American forces faced there, but overcoming the odds. You could have had an Italian campaign that was set in the early stages of the war, with that initial drive across, and trying to push the British back toward Alexandria in Egypt. Then you could have had a British campaign that was, all the way through the early, those losses to the Deutsche Afrika Korps and the Italians, and then had the big turning point Alamein, and then pushing back. And a German one that could have been any selection of that. It was Siege of Tobruk, the defense of Libya, a whole mix of different things. And that would have been great. You would have had 4 distinct factions. I was really sad. This was the opportunity for them to bring in Italy as a playable faction in Company of Heroes, with its full suite of infantry and vehicle units and air assets as support. And they just didn't do it. And I know a lot of people in the past have bemoaned, Italian armor's terrible, this, that, and the other. The same as they cry whenever Japan is mentioned as an idea for a Pacific campaign in Company of Heroes. Company of Heroes for me has never been about the realism, okay? I've never really felt that Company of Heroes was this title that really adeptly wove, historical fact with gameplay, and it feels like it's such a real thing, because I've seen scenarios in Company of Hero games that are very, very not accurate to history. Watching Tetrarch tanks going toe-to-toe with things like King Tigers is not a fact. It's historically would never happen. So it wouldn't really break any gameplay for me if Italian armor was driving around and it was doing damage to Shermans. And you really could have made the Italian faction feel kind of unique in its own respect, because you could have emphasized, yes, the Italian armor, for instance, may not have been as high a quality, but you can have more of it. So you might have a situation where AT weaponry and stuff can kill them quicker, but they're cheaper to produce, for instance, and you can have more like little L6 tankettes and stuff like that, like Semaventes and the Carro Armatos. All those kind of things are in there. They're unique. They're new, and that's what I think Company of Heroes 3 needed, was something new. The second game had the Soviets, and that was all new. You could bring in all kinds of Russian units if you needed to. The third game needed a new faction, and instead we just got more of what we basically had in Company of Heroes 1 and 2. The two German faction idea, it's okay. It's weird in multiplayer then, when you have like Deutsche Afrika Korps units running around in multiplayer, and that's one of the things, that the maps there's woefully... I'm using the term woefully out here, but there really just isn't enough maps to cover the different theatres. If you wanted more battles where you were pitting it where it was like Deutsche Afrika Korps versus American forces or British forces out in the desert, you just can't do it. I think the two 4v4 maps are set in Italy, and the Wehrmacht faction feels kind of incomplete. For some reason, the Wehrmacht don't get access to a Tiger, but the Deutsche Afrika Korps do. It's very strange. Like, I would have given the DAX a more interesting kind of light recce vehicles alongside like the rare things like the Tiger, and the Wehrmacht should have been more about the kind of the solid punch. It's a strange mix of units. But even technically, I felt the game struggled. At launch, I had weird bugs. Things where frame rates would just plummet, and then I'd have to restart the game and it'd be fine again. Just odd visual glitches, AI bugging out, legacy issues coming back in, like units being like trapping themselves within barbed wire when they're building it because they don't know to walk around the other side. Tanks being unable to crush wrecks or run over infantry, even though they could before. There's a lot of weird little things in there that just don't make sense why they're in this game. Maybe it's because they were bringing it out on consoles, and there was a conscious effort to make something that would play easily enough on a console. And it's not to say that RTS games can't be on a console. There has been a history. It's not very large, but there is a handful of games that you can play on console, going, I think, from the PlayStation 1 onwards. I don't know if there's been any prior to that, but I think that's right, that the PlayStation onwards there's been some RTS games across since then. So it's not unheard of, it's just unusual for Relic to do this. I can only assume it's the publisher, it's Sega, telling them that they need to go for a bigger reach, and there's a lot of, obviously, Xbox S, Series S and X players and PlayStation 5, and they want to get the game out on as many platforms as possible. But it's not a good look, and overall, I don't know if I would recommend... I don't think I'd recommend this game brand new. Company of Heroes 3 needs a lot of work. It looks nice, and at times it can capture those moments, especially when you do actually get to the scripted missions in the campaign. They're fun, but you've got to go through so much just generic filler. It's like an anime series where You know, there's the bits that's actually using the manga itself, and then there's those huge filler gaps that are just original stories that are boring and they feel like filler. They're just bland all the way through, and you're waiting for it to get to the next. But that's what playing the campaign is like. There's just all these filler missions you've got to go through. So many painfully generic battles that are just rinse, repeat. They don't change. It doesn't matter if you're leveling up your companies and you're unlocking new units and abilities for them. Ultimately, once you find the right pattern of build order and units to spawn, that's it, really. And then you just steamroll the AI to victory because it's not very smart, it's not very good, it's not very aggressive, and the multiplayer is kind of naff at the moment. It's not basically, if you enjoyed multiplayer in the second game, just keep playing the second game's multiplayer. And if you're playing for the cosmetics in this game, don't pay for them, and grinding for them, it just isn't worth it until there's actually some interesting cosmetics to get that might be of like famous units and stuff. It's not worth your effort. So yeah, maybe on a sale, or just keep an eye on it and see if people's opinions turn. If you see a lot of reviews suddenly going positive, it's probably a good time to start looking into it. But just, yeah, at launch, it was a disappointing game. And, there's so much more I would have liked to have seen from Relic in their return to the RTS platform. And if they do continue with RTS games that are going to use licenses like Dawn of War, I really hope that they learn from the experiences here with Company of Heroes 3 and what they did with Dawn of War 3, and they just sort of look at what made them good to begin with and just make more of that. And that's really all I've got to say. So that's why I'm disappointed with Company of Heroes 3. And yeah, they're all going to be, they're not all going to be doom and gloom. Some of these are going to be more upbeat. They're going to be more why I like certain games, why I love certain games, old and new and current. And yeah, I like this format. You could just see some footage of the game playing, you hear me ramble, you get an idea if you've not played it before, you know what it looks like, you go from there. So yeah, thanks for watching and listening, and yeah. But if you played it, what do you think? Do you like Company of Heroes 3? What were the parts that really annoyed you about it? What are the parts you really love about it? Do you feel like it's a game that's got some legs and it could go somewhere, or do you feel it's a game that's gonna, just die a slow, painful death online? So yeah, I'll catch you in the comments and see you next time. Thanks everybody. Bye bye.